There are moments in life when heaven feels impossibly distant, moments when a person looks up and silently wonders, is anyone listening? Moments when prayers feel heavy, unanswered, almost lost in the vastness of the sky. But then, there are other moments, rare, luminous, when something invisible seems to open, a whisper inside the heart, a warmth that cannot be explained, a sense that grace is no longer far away, but suddenly near, close enough to touch. For generations, believers have tried to understand what unlocks these moments. Why does heaven sometimes respond instantly, while other times everything remains silent? And that question leads us into one of the most misunderstood yet powerful mysteries of faith, the Immaculate Conception, and the step that opens the door to the graces of heaven. This is not a story of theology. It is not a lecture. It is an unveiling, a spiritual key that, when understood, begins to illuminate every corner of the soul. And today, guided by the insights left by Saint Faustina, not her life story, not her biography, but the light she offered, we are going to reveal the single step that allows divine grace to flow with astonishing intensity into a person's life. But before we continue, if you're new here, make sure to subscribe to the channel. This journey is profound, and the next chapters will take you deeper into mysteries that can transform your spiritual life. Stay with us. You won't want to miss what's coming. Now let us begin. To understand the step that opens the door to grace, we need to approach the mystery of the Immaculate Conception not as an idea, but as a movement of heaven. Imagine this. Before time began, before galaxies spun into existence, God envisioned a woman, pure not because she earned purity, but because grace embraced her from the very beginning. Not a purity of external perfection, but a vessel prepared to receive divine love without resistance, without fracture, without fear. The Immaculate Conception is not simply about Mary being preserved from original sin. It is about the possibility of a human heart fully open to grace. And this is where our journey begins. Because Saint Faustina, in her profound spiritual understanding, hinted at something astonishing. What God did in Mary, He desires to reflect in every soul, not in the same measure, not in the same way, but in the same direction. The Immaculate Conception becomes, then, not only a dogma to be believed, but a path to be walked, a path that teaches us the step that unlocks grace. Every grace from heaven moves toward the human heart with the gentleness of a whisper, but grace can be resisted, blocked, even rejected, not intentionally. No one wakes up and says, "I want to close my heart to God today," but the noise of modern life, the fear of surrender, the wounds accumulated through the years, all of these create barriers. And here is the profound insight. Grace flows freely where there is no resistance. Mary, from the moment of her conception, had no interior resistance to God. She was the perfect yes, the perfect openness, the perfect receptivity. And this is where St. Faustina's teaching points to something that shakes the spiritual foundations of every believer. The door to grace opens when the soul takes the same interior step that Mary lived perfectly, a step of absolute, trusting surrender. Not a surrender of weakness, not a surrender of passivity, but a surrender that frees the soul from fear, from self-reliance, from spiritual tension. Before we name the step, we must understand why so many people never take it. Most individuals ask for graces the way someone might knock lightly on a door, hoping someone will hear from far inside a house. But heaven's door is not opened by timid knocking. Heaven's door opens from within. And the key, the one Saint Faustina illuminated again and again, the one reflected in the mystery of the Immaculate Conception, is this: not partial trust, not trust mixed with fear, not trust that negotiates with God, but trust that rests, like a child who feels safe in the presence of perfect love. This type of trust is rare. And because it is rare, grace often remains unopened, unreceived, unwelcomed into the depths of the soul. Mary lived this trust perfectly from her conception. Saint Faustina lived it through surrender. And now we are called to understand it, not as a concept, but as a pathway to supernatural grace. A heart that trusts cannot be manipulated by fear. It cannot be shaken by uncertainty. It cannot be broken by circumstances, because its foundation is not earthly. It is divine. And this is why grace flows abundantly into a trusting soul. Grace seeks a heart that is open, empty of self-reliance, ready to receive. The Immaculate Conception reveals the model. Saint Faustina reveals the application. And you, the one listening, are invited to discover how this single step can transform your spiritual walk, because everything changes when trust becomes total. Where there is trust, there is peace. Where there is trust, there is clarity. Where there is trust, heaven moves quickly and powerfully. And when a soul takes this step, the door that was once closed begins to open, slowly at first, then wider and wider, until grace pours in like sunlight breaking through a window at dawn. Trust is not an emotion. Trust is not a feeling of optimism. Trust is an act, a decision that often begins in darkness. It is the courage to say, God, I give you permission to act in my life. I surrender everything that I cannot control. I believe you are good, even when I do not understand. I open my heart fully to your grace. This surrender is powerful. Heaven responds, grace descends, and the soul begins to feel what Mary lived from the first instant of her being. The freedom of a heart in perfect harmony with God. When trust opens the door to heaven, something extraordinary begins to happen. Not all at once, not always in ways the world can see, but within the soul, quietly, steadily, unmistakably, grace begins to move. Grace does not simply arrive. Grace acts. Grace shapes. Grace reorders the inner world of a person until they begin to reflect the beauty of that openness first revealed in the Immaculate Conception. In this second block, we explore what grace actually does once the soul has surrendered. And to understand this movement, we turn not to theories, but to real stories, real people touched by real grace. People often expect grace to come with fireworks, visions, intense emotions, overwhelming signs. But grace rarely arrives like a storm. It comes like the first breath after years of suffocation. A man once described it like this: I didn't feel anything dramatic. But suddenly the heaviness I carried every morning wasn't there. It was like something had been silently lifted from my chest. This lift, this soft, unspoken shift, is often the first sign that trust has opened the door. Grace doesn't shout, it whispers, and its first whisper is freedom. A woman who had battled bitterness for years shared that after she made a simple act of trust, one sentence whispered with sincerity, her interior life began to change. She said, I forgave someone without trying. It just happened. I realized that grace had done what I had spent years failing to do on my own. Her forgiveness wasn't forced. It wasn't a decision she wrestled with. It was the fruit of something heaven planted inside her. This is the hallmark of grace. It accomplishes what human strength cannot. Once trust opens the door, grace follows a pattern that appears again and again in testimonies from people of all ages and backgrounds. These movements are subtle, but they redefine the soul from within. Below are 4 transformations that occur when grace begins its work, each illustrated with lived experiences. Grace repairs the interior life the way a craftsman restores a damaged sculpture, from within, delicately, without drawing attention. A testimony from a young man explains this beautifully. I was always easily offended. Everything hurt me. After I surrendered my fears to God, it was like the cracks in my heart began to close, not all at once, but day by day I felt less fragile, less reactive. This rebuilding is one of the most astonishing works of grace. It restores emotional structure, strengthens identity, and infuses dignity. Grace gives the soul a new backbone. One of the most consistent testimonies among those touched by grace is this: fear begins to lose its authority. A mother shared her experience. I used to fear everything: the future, sickness, failure. After placing my children in God's hands, my fear didn't disappear instantly, but it stopped controlling me. I started feeling protected, and that changed everything. Grace doesn't erase fear, it disarms it. A trusting soul becomes unshaken not because it is strong, but because it is held. A man who had lived years in spiritual emptiness once said, "When I finally trusted God, I woke up one morning and felt like my life wasn't accidental anymore. Things I ignored began to matter again." Purpose returned to him like dawn after a long night. Grace awakened something ancient inside the soul. The sense that we were made intentionally, that our life is part of something larger than what we see. This transformation is deeply connected to the mystery of the Immaculate Conception. Mary lived her purpose fully because her heart was fully open to God. Grace restored this awareness in him. Perhaps the most unexpected transformation reported by many is the awakening of spiritual sensitivity. A woman described it perfectly. "I started noticing moments of grace I used to overlook, small consolations, little signs, gentle nudges. It felt like heaven had always been speaking. I was just finally listening." Grace opens the senses, not physical senses, spiritual ones. It teaches the soul to perceive God in the ordinary. This is the miracle of openness. The veil becomes thinner. Once trust opens the heart, prayer stops being a request and becomes a relationship. There is a testimony of a father who said, "Before trust, my prayer was a list of problems. After trust, my prayer became a place of rest. I didn't only pray to be heard. I prayed because I knew He was with me." This change marks the beginning of mature spiritual life. The soul begins to pray not out of fear, but out of love. Not out of desperation, but out of communion. The Immaculate Conception reveals what a heart without resistance to God looks like. Mary's heart was transparent. Nothing in her blocked grace. Saint Faustina teaches that the more a soul trusts, the closer it comes to this transparency, even if imperfectly. We are not called to live the same measure of purity as Mary, but we are called to live the same direction of openness. Testimonies show this clearly. Whenever a soul becomes willing, grace becomes active. This is the connection between the dogma and personal transformation. Openness attracts grace. People often expect dramatic signs, but testimonies reveal the real indicators: a sense of peace in situations that used to create panic, a new clarity in decisions, a feeling of being guided rather than abandoned, a decrease in the need to control everything. A quiet joy not tied to circumstances, a softening of the heart toward others, an increase in trust, even when nothing externally changes. These are the fingerprints of grace. Grace is not always felt, but its effects always appear. One of the most striking testimonies came from a man who lived years feeling spiritually numb. He said, "I didn't believe I could change. I didn't believe God cared. When I finally said, 'God, I don't know how to trust you, but I want to,' everything began to shift. Grace didn't make me perfect. It made me alive. Alive. This word captures everything grace produces when trust opens the door. Grace resurrects the soul. When the soul trusts, heaven moves, not loudly, not violently, but with a tenderness that reshapes everything: your fears, your wounds, your thoughts, your relationships, your spiritual senses, your identity, your future. The Immaculate Conception reveals the model of openness. Saint Faustina reveals the key of trust. Your life reveals the fruit when you take the step. One step is enough. One act of trust. One moment of surrender. Heaven is not distant. Grace is not rare. The door is not locked. Everything is waiting for trust. And once trust appears, even imperfect, even small, heaven responds. Always. If this message touched your heart, helped you understand grace more deeply, or opened something inside you, subscribe to the channel now so you can continue receiving teachings that strengthen your faith and illuminate your spiritual journey. There is more to come, and you are invited to walk with us into the mystery of trust, grace, and divine love. Subscribe now, and let heaven continue what it has begun in you.